The fall came quietly. Francis Beck, 73, stood in the kitchen doorway gripping the wooden frame, his knuckles pale, his breath sharp and dry like winter air in his lungs. He didn't remember falling. Only the sharp, strange sound of ceramic breaking, and then silence. Not even pain at first, just the uncanny realization that his face was pressed to the cold tile floor, his cheek wet, his left arm bent at an impossible angle. His wife, Jan, was upstairs. She would come down eventually, but he didn't call out. Instead, he stared at the broken pieces of the coffee mug, the one with the faded "World's Best Lawyer" printed across it, and wondered, bizarrely, how long he had been pretending it was his favorite. At the hospital later, after the stroke was confirmed and his speech returned with slow defiance, Francis sat propped against a white pillow in a blue gown, his hand twitching slightly every few minutes. His adult son stood near the window, saying something about therapy. Jan hovered by the tray table, wiping invisible dust. Francis turned his head with effort. "Can you both leave me alone with the doctor for a minute?" They looked at each other, surprised. He had never said that before, not once in 42 years of marriage, nor in the decades of raising a family where he was always the steady one, the agreeable one, the man who nodded, smiled, and made things easier. Once they left, the doctor, a young man, maybe early 30s, kind-eyed but busy, lowered the chart. "You're lucky," he said. "This could have been worse." Francis's voice came out hoarse but deliberate. "I'm not sure lucky is the word." There was a pause. The doctor looked up. "I spent my whole life," Francis said slowly, "being someone that made other people feel safe. But I never felt safe being myself." The doctor didn't respond right away. His expression softened. He nodded, the kind of nod that didn't come from medical training, but from recognizing something unspoken in another man's eyes. Francis turned toward the window. Sunlight slanted in through the blinds, cutting across the room in golden stripes. The lines made him think of prison bars, though he knew that was dramatic. Still, something about the way the light fell across his body made him feel like he'd been caught in a place he didn't belong. That night, in the quiet of the room after John had gone home and the nurses dimmed the hallway lights, Francis whispered words he hadn't dared say in decades. Not because they were vulgar, but because they were honest. "I don't know who I am when I'm not useful." The admission hung in the air, invisible but heavy. It wasn't grief exactly. It was something older, something buried so long it had grown roots under his skin, shaping his smile, his handshake, his voice, even the way he crossed his legs in meetings to appear calm. The persona, Jung would have called it. The mask he'd shaped over years, not out of vanity, but survival. A performance learned in courtrooms, in PTA meetings, in church pews and Sunday dinners where the goal was never honesty, only harmony. That night, he dreamed of a house he didn't recognize. He wandered through empty rooms with old furniture covered in white sheets. In the corner of one room, a cracked mirror leaned against the wall. When he pulled back the sheet and looked in, the face staring back at him was younger, maybe 35. But it wasn't smiling. It looked tired, real, and afraid. He woke with tears dried on his cheeks. The next day, during a routine session with a speech therapist named Nolan, Francis surprised the man by refusing the workbook. "I want to say something," he said, voice still unsteady. "Not from the list." Nolan blinked. "Of course." Francis took a long breath, held it, then let it go. "I've been a fraud, not to hurt anyone, but to keep the peace. And now that I'm this old, I don't think I know what my real voice sounds like." The therapist didn't correct him. He just nodded and scribbled something in his notebook. Later, Jan returned. She sat beside the bed with a crossword puzzle. At one point, she glanced over and asked softly, "Are you feeling okay?" Frances didn't answer right away. Then, looking at her with a weariness she hadn't seen before, he said, "Do you even know who I am when I'm not fixing everything?" She blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" He looked away. "I think I've been someone you could count on, but not someone you ever really met." The silence that followed was long and complicated. Not angry, just fragile. That evening, a nurse came in to adjust the IV drip. As she worked, she mentioned offhandedly, "You're doing well. Your recovery looks ahead of schedule." Francis nodded but didn't reply. He was staring out the window again, watching the shadow of a leaf tremble on the sill. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Therapy, medications, maybe a new diet. But something deeper had shifted. And for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what he had to do. He was wondering what it meant to be, to sit without performing, to speak without rehearsing, to stop being a symbol for others and start being someone real for himself. And that, strangely, felt terrifying, but it also felt like a beginning. The mask you crafted to survive becomes the mask that chokes you when the applause fades. Harold stood in the hallway, gripping the edge of the door frame with one trembling hand. The sound that triggered him was small, a laugh. Shrill, high, echoing down from the upstairs bedroom where his grandson, Aidan, played with a toy blaster. But something in that laugh, the pitch, the repetition, the way it pierced through the house, cracked through him like a fault line. Without warning, Harold slammed the door shut with a violent snap. The walls shook. The laughter stopped. Silence fell like dust. Aidan's footsteps could be heard padding uncertainly toward the stairs. Harold backed away, breathing hard, his hands shaking not from age but from something deeper, something he didn't understand. "Grandpa?" Aidan's voice was small, cautious. Harold didn't respond. He turned sharply and walked into the kitchen, every step stiff with unspoken fury. He didn't know why he was angry, only that he was. At the sound, at the noise, at the joy. He opened the fridge, stared into it without focus, and slammed it closed again. Something was breaking in him, not a bone, but something much older. His son, Jeremy, arrived moments later. "Dad, everything okay?" Harold didn't answer immediately. He rubbed his temples and forced a brittle smile. "Fine, just a headache." Jeremy nodded slowly, sensing something off. He walked upstairs to check on Aidan, leaving Harold alone again. But Harold wasn't really alone. Something was with him, not in the room, in him. That night, Harold sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the framed photograph of his late wife, Miriam. His jaw tightened. "I don't know what's happening to me," he muttered. He reached for the drawer of his nightstand and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. A therapist had once told him to write when he felt overwhelmed. He hadn't touched it in 3 years. He opened to a blank page, but before he could write, he was interrupted by another memory. Not a thought, a flash. His father's hand slapping the back of his head when he cried at age 9. "Boys don't cry," his father had barked. "Man up." Harold snapped the journal shut and stood quickly. The room spun for a moment. He grabbed the dresser for balance and muttered, "This is ridiculous." But it wasn't. Something inside him was unraveling. The next morning, Harold snapped again. This time, at breakfast. Aidan accidentally spilled orange juice across the table. Jeremy rushed to clean it, laughing lightly. "It's okay, Dad. He's just a kid." But Harold's face turned dark. "You think everything is okay, don't you? You let him run wild. You think you're better than I was?" His voice was louder than it had been in years. His fists clenched. Jeremy froze. "What?" Harold caught his reflection in the mirror behind the table, red-faced, scowling, his lips trembling. Aidan looked terrified. That reflection was not the man he believed himself to be. It was someone older, deeper, raw. That night, after Jeremy took Aidan home early, Harold sat in his armchair, lights off. Rain tapped the windows. The house creaked. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was loud. He whispered, "What is happening to me?" And then he remembered something he once read, years ago, in a yellowed paperback by Carl Jung. "That which you do not wish to be." The quote echoed in his mind. Could this rage have always been there? The calm he had worn all his life, during surgeries as a military medic, during funerals, even during Miriam's, hadn't been peace. It had been control, a mask. And now, with time slowing, distractions gone, the mask was slipping. The next week he forced himself to visit a therapist named Roland Pierce, a younger man, calm, thoughtful. "Why are you here, Harold?" he asked gently. Harold took a long breath. "Because I don't recognize myself, and I'm afraid my grandson is seeing a version of me I buried." Roland nodded. "That version was never buried, only hidden. You're not becoming someone else, Harold. You're meeting who you've always been." The sessions became regular. Dreams began to emerge. Dark forests, closed doors, a boy screaming. Slowly, Harold began to talk about his childhood, about his father, about war, about his failure to grieve Miriam properly. Each story pulled up more of the shadow he had locked away. One day, months later, Harold sat with Aidan in the park. Aidan hesitated before speaking. "Grandpa, you're different." Harold smiled faintly. "How so?" "You don't yell anymore. You listen." Harold looked out at the trees. "I'm trying to meet someone I forgot I was." The boy tilted his head. "Who?" Harold put a hand over his chest. "Me." That night he wrote in his journal. He didn't write much, just a sentence. "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Then he added one more line. "The shadow never leaves. It just grows darker in the quiet corners of your life." Walter's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the phone in his kitchen, the digital screen casting a cold light over his weathered face. He had just heard the words that no father expects after a lifetime of being needed. "I don't need anything, Dad. I'm fine. I'll call you when I can." Click. The line went dead before he could answer. He stared at the phone in his hand as if it had betrayed him. The silence in the room was loud, too loud. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant ticking of a wall clock, the soft thud of a branch tapping against the window, all conspired to make him feel irrelevant. For 40 years, Walter had been someone people called when they needed something. A surgeon, a decision-maker, a problem-solver. Now, with his white coat hung in a closet he rarely opened, he stood barefoot in his kitchen, unsure what to do with the sudden abundance of time and the cruel emptiness it revealed. He sat at the table, folded his hands, and stared at the chair across from him. His daughter used to sit there as a little girl, swinging her legs, asking him how many bones were in the human body. He always had the answers then. Now he didn't even know how to ask the right questions. When the phone rang again 10 minutes later, his heart leapt. But it wasn't her. It was his bank confirming a routine pension deposit. He sighed and rubbed his eyes with the base of his palms. That familiar ache in his chest wasn't physical. It was something worse, a kind of quiet grief no scalpel could remove. Later that week, Walter met his old colleague Raymond at the community center. Raymond had also retired, a former neurologist with too many hobbies and too few meaningful conversations. "You look like you've aged a decade," Raymond remarked, stirring his tea. "What's going on?" Walter shook his head slowly. "I saved lives, Ray, hundreds of them, but I can't seem to reach my own daughter unless there's a crisis." Raymond's eyes softened. "That's because we weren't taught to just be, only to do. You were always the fixer." Walter exhaled through his nose, his eyes drifting to the stained glass window casting fractured light across the floor. "And now, I don't even know who I am without something to fix. Raymond tapped the table. That's the real surgery, my friend. Learning to exist without your function. The words stuck with Walter. On his drive home, the silence in the car didn't feel peaceful. It felt accusatory. The memories came slowly, like water leaking from a cracked faucet. Moments with his daughter where he had solved things instead of simply sitting with her emotions. When she cried, he offered plans. When she questioned herself, he gave advice. But he never asked what she needed most, just presence. At home, he sat in the armchair by the fireplace. A framed photo sat on the shelf, her high school graduation. He remembered fixing the audio system that day when it broke mid-ceremony. He'd felt useful, necessary. Now he realized he never told her how proud he was, just fixed the mic and told her to speak clearly. A quiet knock echoed from the front door. It startled him. No one visited unannounced anymore. He opened it to find a delivery driver holding a package. "For Walter Lane?" the young man asked. "Yes." The package was from a medical journal publisher, his last contribution, a reflective essay on ethics in end-of-life care. He signed for it, then paused as he watched the young man walk away. The boy had earbuds in, eyes glued to his phone, and didn't once look back. Inside, Walter sat down and opened the box. The journal cover bore his name in bold. But it didn't move him. Not anymore. He picked up his phone again, thumb hovering over his daughter's number. But he hesitated. What could he say now that didn't sound like another attempt to do something? His hand lowered. He stood up and walked into the guest room, her old bedroom. The paint was fading and the books were still neatly shelved. A small desk sat in the corner, covered in dust. He sat down at it and pulled open the drawer. Inside was a forgotten letter she had written him for Father's Day when she was 12. "Dear Dad, I don't always understand your work, but I love that you help people. Sometimes I just wish you'd talk to me the same way you talk to your patients, calm, kind, and listening." He read it twice. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He cried, not a stoic tear, not a controlled sniffle. A full-body, aching release of years of being needed but never known. The roles he had played, hero, provider, expert, were dissolving. What remained was a man, not a title. Later that night, Walter left her a voicemail. His voice was slow, uncertain, but clear. "I don't want to fix anything. I just want to talk. If you're ever ready, I'll be here. Just as your father. Not the surgeon. Just me." And in that moment, something inside him shifted. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but like a breath held too long, finally exhaled. "What you are," Jung said, "is what you have always been becoming. Not your job. Not your title. You. When the role fades, the relationship reveals what never truly grew." The typewriter's keys hadn't moved in weeks. They sat in silence like unopened doors in a hallway that led nowhere. Daniel stared at the blank sheet of paper locked in place. Morning light fell across his desk, soft and golden, but there was nothing warm in his eyes. His fingers hovered over the keys, uncertain, then still. Again, the same ritual, the same outcome, the same silence. "I thought it would be easier," he whispered to himself, the words barely audible over the ticking of the wall clock. His study was lined with books, untouched volumes of philosophy, literature, and law, all remnants of the life he had mastered. 32 years as a senior litigator. A man who had never lost a case, who spoke with precision, who knew how to convince a room. But now, alone with his thoughts and a page that refused to receive him, he felt like an imposter in his own life. The house was too quiet since retirement. No ringing phones, no client emergencies, no paralegals knocking on his door with folders and questions. Just this desk, this typewriter, and the unbearable pressure of what he had promised himself for decades. "I'll write when I retire," he used to say, "when I have time." And now he had it, oceans of time, empty and still, stretching endlessly ahead. But the words wouldn't come. Not because there weren't any, but because they were too raw, too close, too far, all at once. He heard a knock, soft and hesitant. His son, Eric, peeked in. "Hey, Dad, you okay?" Daniel turned, managing a forced smile. "Fine, just thinking." Eric stepped in. A grown man now, married with a child of his own. He looked at the desk, at the untouched keys, at the paper that had been white and blank for weeks. He said nothing. He didn't need to. "I always thought I'd have something to say," Daniel finally admitted. "I used to write little things in my head during court recesses. Phrases, ideas, characters. I thought I was just waiting for the right time." "And now?" Eric asked gently. Daniel stared at the page. "Now, I don't know if I ever really believed I could do it. I just liked the idea that I might." Eric sat down across from him. The silence thickened. Between them was more than yours. It was the quiet grief of potential left unclaimed. "You remember Uncle Nathan's funeral?" Eric asked suddenly. Daniel nodded. "You said something that stayed with me. You said, 'The worst kind of death is the one that happens before the body gives out.'" Daniel looked at him. The words came back like an echo from a mountain he never climbed. "I didn't know you remembered that," he said, voice low. "I do, and I think you're scared, not of writing, but of meeting the part of you that never got to live." Daniel's throat tightened. He turned to the typewriter again, but not to write, just to rest his palm on it, like touching an old friend whose name he had forgotten. Carl Jung once wrote, "Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent." And Daniel was beginning to understand what that meant. The dream wasn't just about writing a novel. It was about giving life to the self that had waited in the corners for decades, quiet, observant, unacknowledged. He had given the world a version of himself that was useful, needed, impressive, but never true, never whole. Outside, the wind stirred the branches. A bird landed on the windowsill and tapped briefly before flying away. Daniel's eyes followed it. Then slowly, he pulled the paper from the typewriter and crumpled it. He set a fresh sheet in, not because he was ready, but because the ghost of his unlived life had stopped whispering and started knocking. His hands trembled. He typed one word, "Daniel." Then he paused and smiled, not from joy, but from pain, the kind that tells you something real is finally waking up inside you. Regret is the echo of your unlived life, trying to remind you that you were always more than what you settled for. Mark woke up gasping, his hands clawing at empty air, sweat chilling on his skin despite the spring warmth seeping in through the window blinds. The image was burned into him now, that staircase. It had loomed before him in his sleep again, gray and towering, endless steps reaching toward a place just out of sight. But this time, something changed. The structure groaned, trembled, and collapsed beneath his dream self's feet. He didn't fall. He just stood there, surrounded by rubble, unable to move, unable to climb, unable to even kneel. And a voice, maybe his, maybe not, whispered, "You waited too long." He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor for a long time, the remnants of the dream echoing like a warning bell. At 67, Mark Vensley was not unused to strange sleep. Since retiring from a 35-year career in architecture, he had expected boredom, restlessness, maybe even depression, but not this. Not dreams so vivid he'd wake up with tears running down his face and not know why. The staircase had been a regular visitor in his dreams for almost a year now, always reaching skyward, always unfinished. But last night was the first time it had fallen, and it felt like something in him had fallen with it. Later that day, Mark sat with his longtime friend and neighbor, Russell, a retired therapist who still hosted tea chats for the Wednesday men in their cul-de-sac. They sat on the porch, watching squirrels leap from tree to tree like nothing in the world was worth worrying about. "You ever dream of stairs?" Mark asked suddenly, his voice gravelly. Russell raised an eyebrow. "Going up or down?" "Trying to go up, but they never end. And last night, they just collapsed." Mark looked down at his hands. "I haven't cried like that since my brother died." Russell leaned back. "That's not a dream, my friend. That's a conversation. Your soul just changed the tone." Mark frowned. "I don't follow." "You were trying to ascend something that you kept putting off. That staircase. Maybe it's not about success. Maybe it's about becoming." Mark didn't say anything, but something tightened in his chest. That evening, as he opened the hallway closet to grab an old coat, a folder slid down from the top shelf and hit the floor with a dull slap. Inside were yellowing sketches, floor plans, building outlines, cathedral-inspired domes, and spiraled walkways he had designed in his 20s and abandoned when the firm began assigning him office parks and strip malls. There were even poems tucked in between, awkward, handwritten verses about light, space, and silence. One of them read, "A place is not built, it is remembered by the soul before the body arrives." He sank to the floor and wept. These weren't just sketches. They were the pieces of a self he had put away. Forgotten rooms, a stranger calling his name. By the weekend, Mark's stomach pains, the dull aches he had blamed on aging, intensified. His doctor ordered tests. By Wednesday, the results were back. Stage 4, cancer, aggressive, spreading. The doctor's voice was calm, practiced as he spoke of treatment timelines and experimental options. Mark just sat there, blinking, remembering the sound of crumbling stone in a dream. He drove home in silence. The world outside looked too sharp, too clear, the sky too wide. He didn't feel panic. He felt confirmation. That voice had warned him. The dream wasn't about death. It was about neglect. He had lived efficiently, successfully, but never fully. That night, Mark took out his typewriter, the old mechanical one he'd saved from his college days, and sat at the dining table. For hours, he typed. Not letters, not essays, dreams, fragments, symbols. He made no sense of them. He just obeyed them. The next morning, Russell came by with tea and found Mark asleep in the chair, arms wrapped around the typewriter like it was an anchor. The first page, still in the carriage, read, "I didn't know how to hear my soul. I only knew how to silence it with plans. Do you want to talk about it?" Russell asked gently. "No," Mark said, eyes open but soft. "I want to listen to it." From then on, each night brought more dreams. They weren't peaceful, but they were honest. Sometimes he was a boy running through fields he'd never seen. Sometimes he stood outside a locked door. Sometimes he was back in college, building a museum that had no walls, only sound and shadow. Russell would visit daily. He once asked, "What if the dreams stop?" Mark looked at him, voice steadier than expected. "Then maybe I've finally heard what I needed." As the weeks passed, Mark's condition worsened, but his spirit grew clearer. He began giving away his belongings to people he cared for, not with sorrow but intention. He rewrote his will not just in legal terms, but in emotional ones. He met with old students he had mentored, apologized to a brother he hadn't called in 10 years, and recorded a series of messages for his 2 sons, one for each birthday he feared he wouldn't see. One night he called Russell just before midnight. "I dreamt again," he said. "The staircase is back." "Did it collapse again?" Russell asked. Mark smiled. "No, this time I climbed it, and when I reached the top there wasn't a room, there was a mirror." He paused, tears prickling his eyes. and in it I saw myself. Not the man who played it safe, not the architect. Just me, before the world told me who I had to be. There was silence on the other end. Then Russell whispered, "That sounds like truth." "It was," Mark said. "And it didn't scare me." That night Mark slipped into unconsciousness for the last time. But in his dreams, he kept walking. The dream you ignore is the mirror your ego avoids, but your soul never forgets its reflection. Gerard slammed his coffee mug on the kitchen counter, the sharp sound echoing through the otherwise quiet morning. "He's late. Again," he muttered, glaring at the hallway like it had personally offended him. Outside the window, sunlight crept cautiously across the porch, as if even the day knew not to speak when Gerard's jaw was clenched like that. From the living room came the soft tap of children's shoes and then the bright, carefree laughter of his twin grandsons. But it only deepened the scowl on Gerard's face. "He doesn't respect time. He doesn't respect this house," he said to no one in particular. His wife, long gone, would have known how to diffuse him by now, but she wasn't here. It was just Gerard, the waiting and the irritation clawing under his skin like a rash he couldn't scratch. The front door finally creaked open. In walked Theo, his son-in-law, whistling, sunglasses still perched on his forehead, holding a forgotten soccer ball and wearing a smile that didn't match the time on the wall. "Morning, Dad," Theo said casually. "Sorry, we got caught up at the field. Boys wanted to stay an extra 10 minutes. 10 minutes? Gerard snapped, eyes sharp. "It's been 35. You were supposed to be here at 8, not 8:30. We had a plan." Theo blinked, confused but calm. "I didn't realize it was that serious. The boys—" "It's always like this with you," Gerard barked, voice rising. "You don't follow through. You don't take things seriously. You think everything's just one big joke." The air turned stiff. Theo's smile fell. One of the boys peeked around the corner, sensing the tension. Theo held up a hand and gently nodded for him to stay put. "I didn't mean to upset you," he said quietly. "But why does this always turn into something bigger?" That sentence hit harder than either of them expected. Gerard's face twisted, first in anger, then something else. Something cracked. "Because I can't stand how easy everything is for you," he said, the truth escaping before he could choke it down. "You act like it doesn't matter, like showing up late doesn't mean anything, like being soft is fine." Theo looked stunned. "Being soft?" Gerard stepped back, swallowing against the lump forming in his throat. "You remind me of someone I spent 60 years trying not to be," he said bitterly. "Someone who cried too much, who hesitated, who didn't speak up because he didn't want to rock the boat. That boy was torn apart by his father. I buried him. And now every time you smile and take your time and act like it'll all be fine, I see him again, and I hate him for it." Silence settled like dust on old furniture. Theo stood quietly for a long moment. "I think," he said finally, "that boy's still in there. And maybe he doesn't need to be hated anymore." Gerard didn't reply. His shoulders sagged. He turned away, walked toward the window, and stared out at the lawn like it could explain the parts of himself he still didn't understand. His fingers trembled as they rested on the windowsill. For a second, he imagined his father's hand grabbing his arm, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel anger. He felt the echo of grief. Later that night, Gerard stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring not at his reflection, but at the flicker in his eyes he'd denied for decades. He saw fear, sensitivity, softness, and a long-buried version of himself that had spent a lifetime hiding behind rage. Jung's words came back to him like a whisper. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. He finally understood. The ones you cannot tolerate may be carrying a truth you refuse to meet in yourself. Ellis dropped the remote. It bounced once against the hardwood and skidded under the armchair, but he didn't move. The living room was silent except for the faint hum of the heater and the slow tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. On the muted television, holiday lights twinkled around a smiling host selling kitchen gadgets. Ellis's hands had gone slack. His breathing slowed. The static cheer of the season pressed against his ribs like a vice. Outside, snow flurried against the window pane. Inside, something else was falling, slow, invisible, inevitable. He stared at the darkened TV screen. That's when it hit. The face, the scream, the slam of a door from 1974. He hadn't thought of it in years, but it crashed into his mind uninvited. The night he told his father he wanted to teach music instead of join the family lumber business. The way his father didn't speak, just turned, walked away, and didn't say a single word for the rest of that week. Ellis had buried it, like so many other things, under decades of lesson plans, grading papers, and polite smiles. Now, 3 years into retirement, on the second Christmas without his wife, that silence came back. And it spoke. He got up slowly, knees cracking, and moved toward the kitchen without turning on the light. The familiar creak in the floorboard by the refrigerator didn't comfort him this time. He poured a glass of water and stood there in the dim kitchen, staring at his own reflection in the microwave door. What did it mean when even your silence felt crowded? He hadn't decorated this year. Not since the grandchildren stopped visiting. The excuse was always the same: weather, schedules. Next year okay, Grandpa? But Ellis didn't blame them. He couldn't stand the holidays either. The carols, the forced cheer, the tidal wave of memories. They didn't feel festive anymore. They felt like reminders of everything he'd avoided. He sat at the kitchen table and opened the small notebook he sometimes used to write down quotes he liked. Tonight, his pen hovered over the page, unmoving. Then he wrote 3 words: "I see it." As if that were enough. And maybe it was, for now. But it kept coming. The time he ignored his son's tears when his dog died, told him to toughen up. The moment in '87 when he caught his wife crying quietly in the guest bathroom, and instead of asking why, he walked away, pretending not to see. Give it time, they always said. But time didn't heal. It waited. It observed. It opened drawers you forgot you had. Ellis rubbed his temples. His hands were trembling. He looked up as a loud pop came from the radiator. A memory snapped with it. His mother, yelling at his father about something Ellis had done wrong at 10. He couldn't remember what, but he remembered her words exactly. "He's your son too, Harold. Say something." And Harold didn't. Just the same cold, brutal silence that Ellis later learned to carry like a badge, like a wound. He dropped the pen. The kitchen felt too quiet, too alive. Ellis stood unsteady and shuffled back toward the living room. He passed by the hallway mirror and caught his own face in the dark. Not the teacher, not the father, just the man. The man who had built his life avoiding what hurt. The man who thought retirement meant rest, not reckoning. At the base of the stairs, he stopped. He could hear the radiator groan again, almost like a breath. He clenched the banister and whispered to no one. "That's when all the things I never fixed come back." His voice cracked at the word fixed, and the weight behind it wasn't mechanical. It was emotional. Generational. Buried. The phone rang. He flinched. It was 11:12 p.m. He picked it up. "Dad?" a hesitant voice said. It was Michael, his son. I was thinking about Mom, just wanted to check in." Ellis closed his eyes. There it was, the moment. Not a grand one, but real. "Thanks," Ellis said quietly. "I'm glad you called." There was a pause on the other end. "You okay?" Ellis took a breath. For the first time in weeks, he didn't lie. "No. But maybe it's time I stop pretending." And as he hung up, walked back to the kitchen, and sat down to finish the page. The tears came, quiet, unannounced, like the past itself. He didn't wipe them away. He let them fall. And as the grandfather clock chimed midnight, Ellis wasn't healed, but something inside had been seen. And seeing, Carl Jung once said, is the beginning of integration. Time doesn't erase pain, it peels away the layers until only truth remains. Victor collapsed at precisely 6:42 p.m. One moment he was in control, shaking hands with investors in the sunlit atrium of Meriden Hall, brushing off his assistant's concerns about skipping lunch, standing tall in a sharply cut charcoal suit. The next moment he was on the marble floor, one arm twitching unnaturally, his mouth slightly open but no sound coming out. His assistant, Mark, shouted for help as the boardroom glass doors swung open behind them. The last thing Victor remembered before the blackout was a strange silence, not of the world going quiet, but of something inside him finally stopping. He awoke 2 days later in a recovery room at Severin Medical Tower, half his body numb, the right side of his mouth unable to form words without effort. A doctor, male, early 40s, calm voice, explained the stroke had been severe, but not fatal. You'll need therapy, time, patience. You've been lucky, Mr. Colden. Victor blinked. He didn't feel lucky. He felt defeated. The first week was war. Physical therapy sessions left him drenched in sweat, unable to lift a cup with his right hand. He tried to walk the length of the corridor but collapsed before reaching the nurse's station. He screamed once, not out loud, but into the pillow when no one was watching. His mind, sharp as ever, raged against the betrayal of his body. I'm not done, he whispered to himself. I can't be. Mark visited him with a laptop on the third day. Board wants an update, he said, but Victor couldn't type. His hand refused to obey. He stared at the screen like it had turned to stone. You don't have to reply right now, Mark added gently. They just want to know you're still with us. That night, Victor dreamed of drowning. Cold blue water, his own reflection staring back as he sank. By the second week, something inside him shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It was a quiet, almost reluctant surrender. During one session, as the physical therapist, a tall man named Ellis urged him forward on the walker, Victor paused and asked, "What happens if I stop pretending I'm in control?" Ellis didn't laugh. He only said, "Then the real healing begins." Victor stopped checking emails. He stopped asking about quarterly targets. He started watching the sky. There was a tree outside his hospital window, leafless, weathered, but still standing. He watched it for hours, some days, unsure why it held his gaze. Something about its stillness made him feel less ashamed of his own. A nurse named Randall, broad-shouldered, quiet, mid-30s, began wheeling him to the roof garden each morning. They didn't speak much. Randall let the silence stretch. It was on one of those mornings that Victor saw two birds fighting for space on a single branch. They pushed, fluttered, then both flew away. Victor whispered, "That was me. Always pushing. Always needing to be the one who stayed." Randall looked at him, and, "I'm tired." Weeks passed. The man who once measured his value in contracts and margins began noticing things he'd never seen before, the kindness in Ellis's hands, the patience in Randall's silence, the way his reflection in the hospital mirror didn't look weaker, it looked honest, unmasked. When Victor was finally discharged, he declined the car waiting outside. He walked slowly down the ramp with his cane, breathing in the autumn air like it was a luxury. Mark offered to pick him up. "I'll call you," Victor said, "but not today." He spent the next few weeks in his garden, one he hadn't visited in years despite paying for its care. He felt the dirt with his hands, sat in the sun, watched ants crawl without urgency. One morning, while placing a bird feeder near the old fountain, He said to no one in particular, "I used to build empires, but none of them ever gave me this peace." Later, during a quiet dinner with Mark, no presentations, no pitches, Mark asked, "What changed?" Victor set down his fork. "I stopped pretending I was in charge." Mark smiled, though there was sadness behind his eyes. "So, what now?" Victor looked out the window at the evening sky. "Now I live like I believe it." The wind rustled the trees outside as if nodding in agreement, and for the first time in his life, Victor didn't feel behind schedule, out of control, or broken. He felt present, real. Surrender is not weakness. It's the strength to live without pretending to hold the reins. Samuel knelt in the hallway of his son's home, holding a frayed shoelace between shaking fingers. His grandson, Eli, only 6 years old, stood wobbling on one foot, resting a hand on Samuel's shoulder to balance. The boy's sneaker was covered in mud, the sole barely hanging on, the laces more knot than thread. "I can do it, Grandpa," Eli said with quiet pride. But Samuel smiled, eyes glassy, and replied, "Let me have this one." The hallway was dim, late afternoon light leaking through the side window, catching dust in the air. Eli's laughter from earlier still echoed faintly down the corridor, a remnant of a game he'd been playing alone in the backyard. Samuel tied the knot slowly, carefully, almost ritualistically. He'd built skyscrapers, signed contracts worth millions, but no one had ever looked at him with the kind of raw trust that Eli did now. "Grandpa?" the boy asked, curious. "Why are your hands shaking?" Samuel paused, then gave a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "They do that when you get older," he said, trying to make it light, though inside something tugged hard against his ribs. He stood up, steadied himself against the wall, and watched Eli dart away to the kitchen, calling for more juice. That night, Samuel lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling fan. It spun slowly, whispering like a clock with no numbers, just movement, just time. His suitcase sat unopened at the foot of the bed. The awards plaque from the city, given for his 50-story skyline triumph, was in there somewhere. He had brought it for his son to hang, but it felt absurd now. The glass frame, the bold letters, the words "visionary impact." No one in the house knew where he had kept it all these years. In the morning, over eggs and toast, his son, Michael, barely looked up from his phone. "I saw the pictures of the ceremony," Michael said flatly. "Big turnout." Samuel nodded, but didn't reply. Across the table, Eli smeared jam on toast, the red stain a chaotic fingerprint pattern. "Did you build all the buildings in the world, Grandpa?" Samuel let out a breath. "Not all of them, just the ones I thought would make people feel something." Michael scoffed lightly. "Skyscrapers don't feel, Dad. They're just real estate now." That cut deeper than Samuel expected. He looked out the window instead of answering. The trees outside swayed in the breeze, carefree, rooted. Later that day, Samuel wandered into the garage where Michael had stored old boxes. He found one labeled "Dad's Stuff." Inside were blueprints, a slide rule, a photo of Samuel shaking hands with a former mayor. None of it looked important anymore. On top was a Father's Day card, never opened. He recognized his late wife's handwriting on the envelope. "From Mikey, age 7. The flap was still sealed. He sat on the cold garage floor for a long time. That evening he found Eli sitting on the front steps with scraped knees and a crayon in his hand. "What are you drawing?" Samuel asked, easing himself down beside him. "A building," Eli said proudly, "but not tall, just nice." Samuel smiled gently. "Why not tall?" Eli shrugged. "Tall ones make me dizzy. I want one where people feel good inside." Samuel blinked, caught off guard by the innocence of the words. "That's a good reason," he whispered. They sat together for a while, the old man and the child, the silence between them warmer than any applause Samuel had ever received. When Eli leaned his head against Samuel's shoulder, something inside him shifted, not cracked, not broke, but softened, like steel bending toward grace. That night, Samuel didn't sleep. He wrote something down in his journal before the house woke. I spent my life trying to touch the sky, but the only thing that ever touched me back was a child's hand on my shoulder. 2 weeks later, after he returned to his apartment, Samuel mailed a package to Michael. No note, just a photo of Eli tying his own shoe and the old plaque from the city, now scratched and faint. On the back he had taped a post-it. Legacy isn't what you build, it's what you leave in others. Michael never called. But months later, when Samuel visited again, he found that the plaque was hung not in the office, not in the study, but right above Eli's tiny art table. And beneath it, in bright orange crayon, was a child's scrawl. This is Grandpa's favorite thing. He tied my shoes. Samuel stood in the doorway, overcome by something heavier than pride but gentler than grief. In that moment, he understood what his blueprints never showed him, that the tallest thing a man ever builds might be invisible. The most lasting structures we ever build are the invisible ones we leave behind in people's hearts. The door to the hospital room creaked open just as Dr. Elias Marron drew a shaky breath. His hand, veined and thin now, trembled slightly as he adjusted the oxygen tube beneath his nose. The room smelled of antiseptic and fading lilies, a poor attempt by well-meaning orderlies to cover the scent of slow endings. At 83, Elias had spent a lifetime listening to others speak their truths. As a psychologist, he'd comforted men unraveling in midlife, wives confronting betrayal, soldiers broken by memory. But now, he stared at the one patient he had never dared to fully confront, himself. The young orderly who entered, name tag askew, offered a half-smile. "Just checking your vitals, Dr. Marron." Elias gave a slight nod but said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the window where a single black bird perched on the ledge, tapping its beak against the glass. Tap, pause, tap, like a clock, like a warning, like a whisper. "Are you ready yet?" Later that day, his grandson Julian visited. The boy, now a man, carried himself with that same cautious optimism Elias used to have at 30. Julian placed a bag of books on the side table and leaned forward, brushing dust from the chair before sitting. "You still haven't read this one, huh?" Julian teased, holding up a worn copy of Man's Search for Meaning. Elias smiled faintly. "I thought I had more time." Julian's expression faltered. "You do?" "No," Elias replied quietly. "I don't. And I'm not afraid of that. I'm afraid of what I've left behind, or maybe what I never left behind at all." Julian watched his grandfather's face change, not with fear, but with the kind of awareness that comes only at the edge of things. Elias turned his head slightly, eyes softer now. "There's something no one tells you," he said, voice raspy. "The fear of dying. It's not about death. It's about the life you never lived right. The words you swallowed, the people you never really saw, the version of yourself you buried under titles, under duties. That's what waits for you." Julian stayed silent. The room grew still. Machines hummed low. The bird was gone. "Have you made peace with that version of yourself?" Julian asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Elias looked down at his hand, the one that had signed so many evaluations, diagnoses, marriage licenses, and retirement letters. He flexed it once, slowly, then let it fall. "Not yet," he whispered, "but I've started listening to him." The silence between them wasn't empty. It was sacred. Julian didn't rush to fill it. Instead, he opened one of the books and began to read aloud. The words floated gently, but Elias wasn't hearing them anymore. His mind had wandered back to a moment 20 years ago, an argument with his brother that had never been resolved. He could still hear the last words he said, Sharp and final. He had never called back. The guilt had become part of him, like a quiet ulcer in the soul. I thought I had time then, too. Later that night, as the hallway lights dimmed and the nurse's shoes softened against linoleum, Elias drifted into a dream. He stood in a field, tall grass waving, skies amber with sunset. Ahead, a boy waited. Not Julian, not a patient. It was himself, maybe 7, maybe 8 years old, eyes wide, holding a slingshot and a notebook. The boy didn't speak. He just looked at him. "I forgot you," Elias said aloud in the dream. His voice cracked. The boy stepped forward and handed him the notebook. On its cover was one word: truth. Elias opened it, trembling. The pages were blank, not because there was nothing to say, but because the pages were waiting, still waiting. The boy smiled, and just as he did, a shadow fell across the field. It was not a threatening shadow, not cold, just present, just real. Death, but not a cloaked figure or a voice. It was more like a presence, a reminder, not of endings, but of invitation. Elias looked up at it, and instead of fear, he felt recognition. The shadow didn't move closer. It simply waited, like the boy had waited, like the dreams had waited, like the truth had waited. Elias understood. When he woke, dawn was beginning to filter through the blinds. Julian had fallen asleep in the chair. A nurse passed by but didn't enter. Elias slowly reached for the notebook on his table, the one Julian had brought. He opened to a blank page. Then, with hands that trembled but didn't falter, he began to write. The first line read, "Forgive me, brother." He kept writing. That morning he called his son, then his estranged friend. He asked to speak to the chaplain. He requested that a note be sent to the hospital janitor, whose name he'd never learned but always nodded to. Every act, every word, felt like pulling light from a well he thought had dried up. But it was there. It had always been there. By the time the afternoon sun warmed the tile floor, Elias lay back, peaceful. Julian stood by the window now, watching the bird return. "I think he's ready," Julian said softly to no one in particular. And Elias, eyes closed but heart open, exhaled a final truth, not in words, but in presence. The shadow of death doesn't darken your path. It sharpens your focus on what truly matters. Martin stood in the middle of the room that used to be theirs. The morning light fell softly across the wooden floor, brushing against the chair she had always favored, the one near the window with the chipped armrest she never wanted fixed. His hand hovered over the back of it, not quite touching. Then, slowly, he sat down and opened the leather-bound journal that had become his morning ritual. The words on the page weren't for anyone else, just for her. "I went to the cafe on Linton Street," he wrote, "the one we always passed but never entered. I sat at a table for 2. He paused, pressing the pen to the paper a little harder. The ink blot spread. Outside, the breeze stirred the curtain. It was quiet, too quiet for a man who had once filled boardrooms and dinner tables with conversation. A year had passed since Evelyn died, but the stillness in the house hadn't aged. It had only deepened. At first, Martin had tried to resist it, hosting dinner parties, keeping the TV on, filling the silence with sound, but none of it held. Not really. He closed the journal and looked at the photograph on the nearby table. Evelyn's smile was subtle in that image, her head slightly tilted, as if she had just heard something amusing but wasn't ready to say it aloud. Martin stared at it like it was a riddle he was finally learning how to read. He remembered their last argument. It had been about a cruise. She wanted to see the fjords in Norway. He said it was impractical. "Maybe next year," he had said, brushing it aside with a planner's logic. There was no next year. And now, the fjords became sacred, not because they went, but because they didn't. Missed experiences, it seemed, held a sharper edge than bad ones. One morning, weeks earlier, he had woken from a dream so vivid it left him trembling. In it, Evelyn stood in a garden he didn't recognize. She didn't speak. She only looked at him, a kind of knowing in her eyes that startled him awake. That day, he began visiting the places she had loved, alone. "I think she's visiting me in my dreams," he said once to a friend at lunch. The friend, James, a widower himself, had nodded slowly. "Or maybe you're finally visiting her." The words lingered. Martin started journaling that night. Now, each page became a conversation, a slow return to a part of himself he had neglected. Not the man with answers, not the protector, not the efficient planner, but the man who used to sketch birds in the margins of napkins, the man who remembered the song she had once sung under her breath while cooking eggs. He found himself humming it again, not to remember her, but to feel close to the version of himself who had once listened more than he spoke. His son, Lucas, visited every other weekend. At first, Lucas was concerned. "Dad," he said one Sunday morning, "I know it's hard, but it's okay to move on." "I'm not stuck," Martin replied, his voice steady. "I'm moving deeper." Lucas didn't understand. Not yet, but he didn't argue. Martin wasn't clinging to Evelyn's memory out of grief. Not anymore. He was beginning to understand something else, something quieter and harder to explain. He wasn't just remembering who she had been. He was uncovering who he still was. Their love wasn't extinguished. It had changed shape. It no longer lived in anniversaries or photographs or shared routines. It lived in silence, in reflection, in the invisible thread that still connected their souls across the veil of time. He went back to writing. "You always said I was too logical," he wrote. "I think I'm starting to understand what you meant. Love isn't something you plan, it's something you meet." He stopped. A tear traced down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it. He looked out the window and whispered, "I miss you." There was no reply, only the sound of the wind against the glass. And yet, in that stillness, something stirred within him, not grief, but presence, a soft warmth in his chest, a quiet awareness. That night, Martin lit a candle before bed. He no longer prayed for her to return. He simply thanked her for staying in ways he had never noticed before. In dreams, in songs, in memory, in becoming. Carl Jung had written once, "The meeting of two souls is not always loud. Sometimes it is silent recognition across the veil of time." Martin smiled faintly, turned off the light, and let the silence hold him like an old friend. Real love begins when the ego no longer demands, but the soul quietly understands. Samuel sat at the edge of his old drafting table, staring at a blank sheet of paper. The morning light filtered through the blinds of his study, casting long bars across the mahogany floor. Dust particles floated in the sunbeam, suspended like forgotten dreams. The mechanical pencil in his hand hovered motionless. He hadn't drawn a single line in 6 months. Not since he left his engineering firm, not since the applause stopped. His wife had gone to the market. The house was silent, too silent. Silence used to be his friend when he was designing infrastructure, system flowcharts, solving crises before they happened. But now, silence had turned into something else. A witness, a mirror, and it was starting to ask questions he didn't know how to answer. A knock sounded at the door. He flinched, but no one came in. Just the old habit. In his previous life, there was always someone needing something, a report, a blueprint, a decision. Now no one knocked unless it was the delivery man, or worse, silence itself knocking louder. He rose and shuffled to the kitchen. He hadn't eaten breakfast. He wasn't hungry. He hadn't been truly hungry for weeks. Not for food, anyway. There was a kind of hunger gnawing at him now that no meal could satisfy. It was the ache of not knowing who he was without a schedule, A deadline, a purpose handed to him in email or ink. Later that afternoon, he sat across from Dr. Relin, a soft-spoken man with a neatly trimmed beard and a voice like a warm towel. They had met through a senior wellness group his wife insisted he join. Samuel hated groups, but he had grown to respect Relin, mostly because the man didn't pretend to fix anything. "I don't know who I am without my work," Samuel confessed. Relin didn't blink. "Then maybe now is when you finally get to find out?" Samuel scoffed. "I'm 71. Isn't that a little late to find out who you are?" "Depends on what's been stopping you," Relin replied. "Tell me, what did you love before the world told you what to do?" The question lingered in the air. Samuel opened his mouth, closed it. Then, poetry and drawing. I used to paint watercolors when I was a boy, landscapes mostly. "When was the last time you did that?" A long pause. Samuel shook his head slowly. "My father said it wouldn't pay the bills, so I stopped." "And did your career pay the bills?" "Yes." "Did it feed your soul?" The question landed like thunder in a quiet room. Samuel looked away. His eyes misted. That night he pulled open the attic closet and found his old sketchbook, buried beneath blueprints and awards. The pages were yellowed, but the ink was still strong. He sat on the edge of the guest bed and flipped through each one. Rivers, mountains, a boy's handwriting. His. The next morning he bought paints. He didn't tell anyone. It felt foolish at first, a man of his age starting again, but there was something sacred in the brushstrokes, like meeting a part of himself he thought had died. And yet here it was, breathing. Weeks passed. His mornings changed. No more staring at blank pages. Now he filled them, with trees, with skies, with silence that didn't mock but listened. His wife noticed. One evening as they walked through the park, she slipped her arm into his and said softly, "You're softer now, but stronger too." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. He felt it too. One day, a neighbor boy knocked on his door. "My mom says you used to build things," the child said, holding up a toy drone with snapped propellers. Samuel smiled. "Still do," he said, and led him inside. The house smelled like oil paint and cedar. Sunlight poured over a new canvas, half finished, a mountain under construction. But for the first time, he wasn't building something for approval. He was building to remember, to become. He kept a journal now, nothing fancy, just scribbles, thoughts, dreams. Sometimes he woke from sleep and wrote down fragments, a song he once hummed, a path he never walked, a name he stopped using when he became a man. He wrote it again. Samuel, no title, no credentials, just the name. He was beginning to see the man behind the mask, not the engineer, not the provider, just the one who'd been waiting all along, the self. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The truth is, you either answer this inner call, or you die having only lived someone else's story. Have you felt this quiet longing to return to yourself? Individuation is not a luxury after 60. It is the soul's unfinished business. The old man was already seated on the weathered bench by the pond when the sun broke through the gray morning haze. He didn't shuffle or adjust his coat like he usually did. He simply sat, eyes fixed on the tree where the first robin had landed. For 17 years, Milo had returned to this park bench every morning, just after dawn. He wore the same brown coat, carried the same folded newspaper he never read, and stared at the birds as if they were speaking a language he once knew but had long forgotten. That morning, he whispered aloud without turning his head, "You're early." The robin tilted its head, chirped once, and flew off. Milo's lips twitched at the corners, the start of a smile not fully formed. Behind him, the world was stirring, joggers, dogs, rustling leaves, but he didn't turn. He never turned. It was as if he was guarding something invisible in front of him, something that lived in the stillness. Years ago, Milo had been the kind of man people called pillar of the community. A judge, a father, a husband. At dinners, his voice filled rooms. In courtrooms, it carried sentences that made headlines. But now, at 82, he found that silence said more. His wife had passed 10 years ago. His sons called on birthdays. One lived in another country. The other didn't speak much anymore, not since the fight. Yet here, surrounded by morning fog and bird song, Milo felt something else. Not company, exactly. Not even peace, but something older than both. "I used to think loneliness was a punishment," he said softly to no one. "Now I see. It was a reminder." A boy on a bicycle sped past him. He didn't flinch. Instead, he looked up finally at the sky, not at the clouds, but past them. The truth had been forming for months, maybe years. It started in his dreams, dreams without sound, just images, a hallway filled with doors, but all of them were locked. A younger version of himself in the mirror, looking disappointed. Then the birds began arriving, right when the dream stopped, as if something had finally gotten through. There had been one morning, last winter, when a stranger, a man maybe in his 50s, sat beside him without asking. The man didn't speak at first. He just watched the same tree. "I come here when I don't know who I am anymore," the man finally said. Milo had turned then, slowly. "And do you remember?" The man shook his head. "No, but I remember who I was before I became who they needed me to be." They never exchanged names, but Milo never forgot the sentence. It echoed louder than church bells, louder than the voices of his youth. Now the bench was his chapel, the tree his scripture, the birds his liturgy. "You only feel alone when you forget there's someone still waiting to meet you," Milo murmured. His voice was thin now, like wind between reeds. "And he's been waiting a long time." He placed the newspaper on his lap and folded his hands. Not in prayer, in remembrance. His fingers brushed the old wedding ring he still wore. He thought of his wife, the way she used to sit beside him in silence and somehow speak entire conversations with her presence alone. In the quiet, a sudden breeze stirred the reeds by the water. A ripple passed across the pond's surface, distorting the reflection of the bare trees. Milo saw something in the water, not his face, but a version of himself long forgotten. A boy watching birds, a teenager reading poetry, a man laughing too hard with his friends, all the selves he had pushed aside to wear the robe, speak the judgments, hold the title. "I was never alone," he said, a tremor in his voice. "I just forgot to listen." And as the robin returned to the same branch, Milo finally looked at it, not as a bird, but as a messenger. Of silence, of memory, of the self. Carl Jung once wrote, "In each of us there is another whom we do not know." Milo now knew who that was. He had met him at last, not through achievement, not through noise, but through stillness. He stood slowly, legs aching but heart clear, and whispered with the finality of a man who had made peace with both the world and himself. The final journey of life is not outward, it is inward, where your truest self has been waiting all along.